Are you struggling to understand everything you need to know for AP European History Unit 4? You know I got you, boo. Well, I'm Steve Heimler, and I'm here to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, well, then let's get to it. So this unit is, in large part, all about Europe's thinky people and how their ideas changed the social, political, and economic landscape of the continent. So I reckon we ought to start with the advances in science, which is to say the scientific revolution. Now, there were 3 big categories of change during this time, all of them emerging out of this new emphasis on Renaissance humanism: astronomy, medicine, and reasoning. With respect to astronomy, which is the study of the physical universe, let me first tell you what the prevailing view of the universe was, and then I'll tell you how it changed. Ancient Greeks like Aristotle and Ptolemy developed the geocentric model of the universe, which put the Earth at the center of everything. Every other body in the galaxy circled around the Earth, including the Sun, and this was the assumed understanding of the celestial spheres throughout medieval Europe, and it's important to know that this was also the Catholic Church's view. But during our period, 3 guys came along and took a massive empirical dump all over the prevailing view. The first was Nicolaus Copernicus. Through complex mathematics, Copernicus challenged the geocentric view of the universe and instead put forth the heliocentric view, which said that the Sun was at the center and the Earth, along with all the other heavenly bodies on display in the sky, revolved around the Sun. Additionally, he was able to demonstrate that the reason it appears that the Sun is rising and setting is because the Earth itself spins upon its axis. And look, he'd have to do that with complex mathematics because that is not at all how it looks to the naked eye. Then came Johannes Kepler. He built upon Copernicus's model by again doing complex mathy stuff, and he accomplished 2 things. First, Kepler affirmed Copernicus's claim that the Sun was at the center of our galaxy. Second, he found that planets orbited the Sun not in perfect circles, but rather in ellipses. And third, you need to know Galileo Galilei. You see, both Copernicus and Kepler came to their conclusions mainly by mathing them out with their thinky part. But Galileo took those conclusions even further by taking them out of the brain and instead using his eyeballs. He built a contraption called a telescope, which allowed the human eye to see far greater distances into space. Now, he didn't invent the telescope, but he did build one for himself. And with the telescope, Galileo was able to observe in detail the moons of different planets, and he was able to prove that those other planets weren't celestial bodies of light, as had previously been believed, but rather they were made out of the same stuff as Earth. Now, as each of these men did their work, they were overturning previous assumptions about how the cosmos worked. And presumably, it won't surprise you to know that the Catholic Church was none too happy about this. Now, many of these developments were occurring during the Catholic Reformation, and if you'll remember when we talked about that back in Unit 2, you'll remember that one of the products of this reform movement was a list of banned books. Well, Copernicus and Kepler's books ended up on those lists, and why is that? Well, because according to their reading of the Bible, Aristotelian cosmology squared nicely with scriptural accounts of the cosmos. Genesis 1 says that the earth is set upon foundations and that there is a firmament in the sky dividing the earthly realm from the heavenly realm, which is to say, by the Church's reckoning, the Bible put the earth at the center of the created order. So these new ideas from Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo challenged not only well-vetted ancients like Aristotle and Ptolemy, they were suggesting that the Bible got it wrong with respect to the ordering of the cosmos. And if European history teaches us anything, it teaches us that if you start telling the Church it's getting something wrong, you're about to get burnt. Anyway, the Church put Kepler and Copernicus on their prohibited books list. And despite the fact that Galileo was a deeply committed Catholic himself, the Pope went ahead and charged him with heresy, and Galileo was forced to spend the rest of his days under house arrest. But his works were published after his death, and as it turned out, he was right. Okay, that was what was happening in the world of astronomy. Now let's shift and talk about the advances that were happening in medicine and anatomy. And the same thing was happening here. Ancient Greek understandings of the human body and medicine were being overturned by the thinky people. So what was the prevailing view in these fields? For that, let me introduce you to our boy Galen. He was an ancient Greek whose work in anatomy and physiology was widely accepted throughout medieval Europe. Galen advanced what he called the humoral theory of the body. And basically, it said that the body was composed of 4 kinds of substances, or humors. And those substances were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And if you're listening closely, that means according to Galen, about 25% of your body is made up of phlegm. Anyway, according to Galen, when these 4 humors were in balance, the body was healthy. But when they got out of balance, that was the cause for sickness and disease. But just like in the cosmological realm, new thinkers came along in this period to challenge Galen's theory, and they developed a new understanding based on observation and experimentation. Now, the first name you should know is Paracelsus, and he rejected the humoral theory of disease and claimed that it was chemical imbalance that caused disease. And if that was true, then chemical remedies could solve those imbalances. So for example, if a person has dry, flaky skin and is tired all the time, that's a sign not that the humors were out of balance, but instead that the body had a chemical imbalance, in this case, an iron deficiency. Galen would have seen those symptoms and drained some blood out of the person to bring the humors back into balance, but Paracelsus argued that a person should be given more iron. Totally obvious to us, but it was revolutionary back then. The second name you should know is William Harvey, who further overturned Galen's ideas, this time about the circulation of blood. Galen thought that there were 2 different different systems of blood contained in the body and that they did not interact with one another. Harvey, on the other hand, through experimentation, discovered that the circulatory system was one integrated whole. Blood is pumped out of the heart through the body and returns to the heart to do the whole thing over again. And finally, new methods of reasoning were being developed during this period, and again, this was done based on mathematics and empirical experimentation. Francis Bacon argued that knowledge came by empirical research, and he was the pioneer of inductive reasoning. This meant that if you wanted to know about anything, Bacon argued you started by observing the smallest parts of the thing and then moved to general principles from there. René Descartes was known for championing deductive reasoning. Descartes started with the largest possible principles, like those things that cannot be doubted. For example, everything is made of matter. From those big ideas, then you could work your way down to knowledge of the specifics. Either way, both of these men were among the first major players in challenging the dominance of ancient Greek philosophy and developing the basis for a new means of understanding the world, namely the scientific method, which emphasized observation and experimentation in order to understand the physical world. Now, despite these massive innovations in how humans understood the world and the world beyond them, older beliefs continued to persist. For example, most of the innovators that I just mentioned continued to believe in God and that the world was ruled and influenced by spiritual forces. A good portion of the folks blowing our minds about how the cosmos were actually situated continued to believe and practice in astrology, which is the study of how the position of heavenly bodies influence human events. Furthermore, they continued the pursuit of alchemy, which was a kind of pseudoscience that attempted to turn certain metals into gold. And so it's really important for you to remember that the scientific view of the world did not come in to replace the more magical view of the world all at once. Okay, so the Enlightenment was a movement built upon the radical shift in thought that occurred during the scientific revolution. Enlightenment thinkers applied those new methods of reasoning to politics, society, and human institutions. And in doing so, they similarly overturned many of the ideas that were accepted as gospel truth, and it's no shock that the Enlightenment began in France. This was the state with the strongest absolutist government, and the people were sick of the control imposed upon them by the French monarchy. And so a lot of the new ideas in the Enlightenment started as reactions against that kind of absolutism. So with respect to society and human institutions, let me introduce you to two of the French philosophers. First and probably most important was Voltaire. Now, that wasn't his real name, but like Madonna and Beyonce, he was bad enough to go by one name. Voltaire was easily the most famous and representative of the French philosophers. He produced voluminous writings in many different genres that all had one thing in common: criticism of the social and religious institutions of France. And one of his most biting criticisms concerned the religious intolerance that he observed in France. He spent some time in England and he saw that because so many competing versions of religion were allowed, they were able to exist peacefully. By contrast, in France, where Catholicism was forcibly imposed upon the population, Voltaire viewed it as oppression. Now, he did believe in natural rights and argued for reforms in education and free speech, but he did not believe that people were capable of governing themselves because, let's be honest, the mass of people are selfish, ignorant turds, and thus they needed a strong, enlightened monarch to rule them. Okay, the second French philosopher you need to know is Denis Diderot. Not Dennis, that's the guy who sells you beepers in the subway station. Denis. Anyway, Diderot sought to catalog the whole body of knowledge according to Enlightenment principles. To this end, he edited and published the incredibly influential encyclopedia whose subtitle tells you everything you need to know about this work: The Rational Dictionary of the Sciences, the Arts, and the Crafts. First emphasis on rational, second emphasis on the sciences, the arts, and the crafts. In other words, a rational explanation of everything. Diderot gathered leading thinkers to produce over 72,000 entries for the encyclopedia, and the result was revolutionary. Science and rationalistic ways of knowing were exalted while religion was poo-pooed. The writers criticized old social institutions and religious intolerance, and in general, this set of volumes summed up the whole worldview of the Enlightenment. And maybe it goes without saying, but the French government was not a big fan of such work because those thinkers seemed to want to take their power away. Now, Enlightenment thinkers were also responsible for new ways of thinking about God. Voltaire developed Deism, which argued that there was a God, but that God did not intervene in human affairs. Instead, God was like a cosmic clockmaker that put all the pieces in place, wound the thing up, and then just let it tick away. And this, of course, meant that the miracle stories of the Bible were cast out as relics of an unenlightened past. Deists argued that God ruled the world by unchanging laws of physics, not by performing miracles which defied those laws. Diderot was also a deist, and as such did not agree with organized religion. And remember, both Voltaire and Diderot are living in France, which is a Catholic state, and because religion and politics were so closely bound up there, to say anything against religion was to call into question the state as well, so, things got tense. Additionally, Diderot defined atheism in his encyclopedia as someone who knows about God and consciously rejects God's existence. If someone was an atheist, that meant that there was no God, and that anything that could be known was understood not by revelation, but through human senses interacting with the material world. And I should also mention another guy under this heading, namely the Scottish thinker David Hume. He developed the philosophy of skepticism, which argued that the ideas in our brains only reflect our sensory inputs, therefore, reason cannot convince us of anything beyond what our senses can interpret. Or to say it another way, the only thing a person can know for sure is what that person experienced experiences through their senses. In that way, skepticism leads a person to question everything, including questioning the dogmas of the church. I hope you can start to see a theme here. So much of what occurred during the Enlightenment chipped away not only at the absolute power of political authority, but absolute religious authority as well. Now, one of the most significant results of these new ideas about religion was this: religion was increasingly viewed as a matter of private rather than public concern. And to be clear, this was the view that people who were not kings began to hold. As should be clear from this and the previous units, absolutist monarchs very much thought that religion was a public concern, but on the ground level among the people, this began to shift. As structures of society grew increasingly secular, the religious emphasis moved from public belonging to private belonging. Like if someone were to ask you if you were a Christian before the Enlightenment and you lived in a Christian state, the answer would be yes, like I'm a citizen of England and therefore I'm a Christian. But new revival movements began to emphasize personal conversion, not state belonging, as the litmus test for true belief. A good example of this was the religious revival of German pietism in the 17th and 18th century. Led by Count Nikolaus von Zinzendorf, pietism taught that true religious experience was not just about belonging to a church, but rather was bound up in a mystical, personal, religious experience. Now, in much of Germany, of course, Lutheranism was the accepted religion, but Zinzendorf reacted strongly against the rationalistic approach to Christ that they had preached. In fact, he once said, "He who wishes to comprehend God with his mind becomes an atheist." So, you know, he was kind of a moderate. Okay, so not only are people conceiving of new ways of thinking about God, but others are applying this kind of rational postulation towards politics as well. For this, let me introduce you to John Locke. In order to understand the thinking of John Locke, you need to understand the concept of natural rights. This is the idea that human beings, just by virtue of being human beings, possess rights like life and liberty and property. These, according to Locke, are given by the Creator, which is to say God. And this was a big deal because if humans have been given rights by God, then that meant that those rights did not come from a monarch or a government. And that further means that a monarch or government could not take those rights away. And even further, that meant that the power of the state actually originated with the people, which is an idea called popular sovereignty. So if that's true, then the people can only be governed by their own consent and not the divine right of kings. No. Oh yes. And remember back to the last unit when we talked about the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary assumed the throne of England, but only on the condition that they signed the English Bill of Rights. And that tastes like some John Locke sauce to me. And then there was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And to be fair, Locke and Rousseau had several overlapping ideas, but I'm only going to tell you the ideas for which they're most known. You need to associate Rousseau with the idea of the social contract. If people really did have natural rights, then when they establish a government in order to protect those rights, they are entering into a social contract with that government, and there are two sides to that contract. The people willingly surrender some of their power to create a government, and they do that so that the government will then protect their natural rights. And the assumption here is that the government will act in accordance with what the people want, and Rousseau's term for that was the general will. And if the government fails to do that, then the people have the right to dissolve the contract and install a new government. And if you're an American and that sounds familiar, it's because those ideas are written into our Declaration of Independence. And just for poops and giggles, you should know that Rousseau argued that men and women were fundamentally different kinds of beings, and thus rigid gender roles should be applied to each. Women should be subordinate to men because, after all, who is going to make the man a sandwich if not the woman? His words, not mine. And further, those women that have children should remain in the home to raise them. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was an English writer and philosopher, not surprisingly, vehemently opposed these rigid gender categories. In opposition to Rousseau, she wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, in which she argued that women are not in fact inherently inferior to men, but in whatever way women seem to be inferior, it's only because education and opportunity have been denied to them on account of their sex. And then it was our boy Adam Smith who applied Enlightenment thinking to economics. In his book The Wealth of Nations, Smith attacked the mercantilist policies of many European nations. He argued that governments ought to get their filthy hands out of the economy and instead let people make economic decisions based on the laws of supply and demand. And this way, the invisible hand of the free market would increase the prosperity of nations and abandon mercantilist economic policies. Again, this is not just thinky stuff. To criticize mercantilism was to criticize the economic system of choice for absolutist monarchies. Okay, so now I've given you a brief sketch of some of the major ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, but let's take a moment to consider how those ideas spread. And the first way they spread, wait, you should know this. In what way did any ideas spread across Europe over the last few units? The printing press. That is correct, me from the other camera. The printing press helped spread Enlightenment ideas. But there were also new institutions that were developed specifically to discuss and spread Enlightenment ideas, and the most significant of these was the Salon. Nope, not that Salon, that Salon. Basically, salons were private meetings held in opulent houses where the intelligentsia openly discussed and debated these new ideas of the day. Many of the most well-known salons were hosted by women. For example, Madame du Deffand, who held a weekly salon Salon in her home. But hold on just a second. You have to understand not just that the ideas spread, but you need to understand why it was important that these ideas were spreading. The more they spread, the more people began to grow dissatisfied with the prevailing political institutions, and that dissatisfaction is going to have consequences in the next unit in the form of the American, French, and Haitian Revolution. Now, you didn't think the Enlightenment wasn't going to have influence over power structures, did you? You so crazy. Now remember that the last development in political power we considered was absolutism, by which monarchs sought to consolidate as much power as possible under themselves. In some cases, this led to religious intolerance, as is the case of France under Louis XIV, and in other cases it led to relentless territorial expansion, as is the case of France under Louis XIV. But the proliferation of Enlightenment thought influenced the absolutist movement. Some monarchs sought to become enlightened absolutists, and you should know a few names here. But before I introduce you to them, let me make clear two things about the enlightened portion of their title. First, they acted in enlightened ways when it benefited them. And second, they were very short-sighted in the reforms that they enacted. In general, they only looked to the immediate impact of those reforms, which would help them stay in power, and not to the long-term impact, which would make the people want more rights, which ultimately would hurt the power of the monarchy in the long run. Okay, caveat done. Now let me introduce these folks to you. First was Frederick II of Prussia, otherwise known as Frederick the Great. Recall that the Peace of Westphalia recognized the sovereignty of the individual states of the Holy Roman Empire, and that had the effect of weakening the empire. Instead of one emperor ruling over all, now there were 300 sovereigns vying for power. In this context, Prussia rose to power under the leadership of Frederick, who made Prussia one of the leading military forces in all of Europe. So what made Frederick all enlightened and whatnot? Well, he was concerned that he would serve his people well, and considered himself not their dictator, but rather their benefactor, and you can surely see the Enlightenment influence there. Additionally, Frederick patronized the philosophers, and by Voltaire's reckoning, Frederick was deemed a philosopher king. He also increased the freedom of speech and the press, and he reformed the judicial system to eliminate class differences under the law. But remember, it's not as if he's doing all this out of the goodness of his own heart. Many of these reforms were undermining the nobility in Prussia, and that helped consolidate power under Frederick. Okay, another enlightened absolutist you should know is Catherine II of Russia, better known as Catherine the Great. And what was so enlightened about her? Well, she reformed the penal system to outlaw torture and capital punishment, reformed education, and patronized the arts. To be fair, she did grow more conservative later in her reign, but all in all, she falls under the category of enlightened absolutist. But again, the reason she was doing all of this was to maintain her power. Catherine, like Frederick in Prussia, enacted an awful lot of reforms that undermined the nobility, and where's that power gonna go? Catherine. Now, enlightened or not, by 1800, most governments in Western and Central Europe had increased their religious toleration to Christian minorities and Jews. A big influence on this was John Locke's insistence of the separation of church and state. If the state no longer controlled the church, then it was no longer a threat to a monarch's power for his or her subjects to hold different beliefs. For example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, written in 1789, proclaimed religious freedom for all French citizens. Catherine the Great over in Russia recognized Jews as Russian subjects and extended more civil liberties to them under the Charter of Towns in 1782. Now, Jews were still basically second-class citizens during Catherine's rule, but regardless, they did make some gains during this time. Okay, now we've talked a lot about what was going on during this period in the upper echelons of society, but now it's time to look at what was going on down below in general society. Now, during this period, we're going to witness a rapid transition between pre-industrial Europe and post-industrial Europe. Now, the first of the major transitions we need to talk about is with respect to food and the population. There was a dramatic increase in population during this period due to two factors. Birth rates were slowly increasing, but thanks to advances in medicine, death rates were simultaneously decreasing. Not only were way more infants surviving childhood, but people were healthier and stronger and therefore living longer lives. Add to that the bubonic plague, which killed massive amounts of people in the 14th century and then went away and then came back over and over again, just suddenly died out. Historians dispute why that happened, but the point is, without the Black Death, more people were living into older age. Additionally, smallpox was another deadly disease that frequently killed large portions of the population. But thanks to Edward Jenner's new vaccine against smallpox, much of the sting was taken out of this disease and thus it killed less people. So, babies are surviving infancy, people are living longer, and hey, that sounds like a good thing, right? Well, not if you're Thomas Malthus. He observed that while the population rate was increasing, the food supply was not going to keep up with it. And that meant that unless either the population was cut off or there was some way to increase the food supply, then the result would be massive amounts of death by starvation. So, you know, not the kind of guy you want to invite to your kid's bar mitzvah. You know, I'm really glad that David's becoming a man today, but in the long run, it doesn't really matter because everybody's gonna die of starvation. Huzzah! Anyway, as it turns out, Europeans did solve the food problem in a series of events that became known as the Agricultural Revolution. During this period, more land became available for farming, for example, in places like England and the Netherlands. They built dikes and drained wetlands in order to plant more food, and also advances in crop rotation yielded more abundant crops. Instead of letting a portion of land lie fallow, farmers discovered that planting crops like beans and clover would replenish the soil. And that meant that all the land was productive, not just part of it. Additionally, there were advances in agricultural technology that contributed to this revolution. Europeans began selective breeding of livestock, combining the best specimens specimens of animals in order to yield better quality livestock. Also, there was Jethro Tull's seed drill, which planted seeds with precision deep in the soil so that the wind couldn't blow them away, which had the effect of increasing crop yields. And better transportation systems were built in many states as well. Canals were linked and expanded, roads were improved, and bridges were reinforced. All of this made it cheaper and more efficient to transport food to the growing population. However, in all this talk about population explosion, I should mention at least one pattern that hindered population growth, and that's the European marriage pattern. With a new emphasis on the nuclear family, which was a separate entity from the extended family, people were marrying later and later. And that's because in order to create a new family unit, you had to have enough wealth and resources to start their own independent family. And that took time, so people began marrying later and women were having fewer babies. Even so, you should also know that during this period, the rate of babies born to unwed parents spiked dramatically. These were known as illegitimate births. And what this indicated is that people were having way more intimate relations outside of marriage than was previously the case. But don't worry, there was still a significant social stigma against unwed mothers giving birth outside of marriage, and many of them had to turn to prostitution as a result. Speaking of families and children, as infant and child mortality decreased and families had more disposable income, families began dedicating more space and time to children and child rearing. In fact, the thinky people were starting to pontificate on childhood as well. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that children were a separate kind of being and that their childhood should be elevated by attentive parents, and therefore they should be playing before they got thrown into the adult world of work. And this was a massive shift in how people thought about children. Like, before this period, children were just seen as small-sized adults. So they worked like adults and they were disciplined severely. But during this period, notions of childhood changed. For example, Napoleon, on whom much more in Unit 5, established a school system in France in 1802 which used a common curriculum to turn children into more well-rounded citizens. Okay, so that's what was going on with food and families, but we also need to talk about another significant social change during this period, namely the large-scale migration of people from rural areas to urban areas. Largely because of technological advances like the steel plow and the seed drill, fewer workers were required on farms. Therefore, in order to find work, many rural folks moved to the city, a process known as urbanization. But as this began to occur on a large scale, cities were crushed by the onslaught of people streaming in, and that created some problems. First, there wasn't enough housing for all these people, so to solve that problem, a new kind of housing was created called the tenement. These were hastily constructed apartment buildings which had rooms that workers could rent for a pretty low price. However, they were not well ventilated and there was no indoor plumbing. The poor ventilation meant that airborne diseases like tuberculosis could spread rapidly. No indoor plumbing meant that people had to take their waste and throw it out the window onto the street. So, needless to say, the cities were, to use the technical historical term, a stanky. And so with all of these working poor crowding into the cities, other urban residents were faced with the problems of poverty like crime and prostitution. And in order to address these problems, authorities passed laws meant to eradicate them. A good example is England's Contagious Disease Act of 1864. This law was meant to crack down on prostitution. Like, if a woman was suspected of such licentiousness, she would be arrested and subjected to forced bodily inspections to determine if she was carrying a venereal disease. If so, she was put in a high-security hospital and treated like a prisoner. Okay, in the final section, let's consider how European cultural and intellectual life was maintained and changed throughout this period. First, let me tell you about the reading revolution. Due to the increasing influence of the printing press, people began reading at a rate that far exceeded anything that came before it. Not only did the amount of books increase, but the kinds of books began to vary widely as well. For example, in France, the number of religious devotional books began to decrease, and books on history and law and science and the arts began to increase rapidly. And so with all these new ideas floating around, censorship increased to keep them at bay. And mainly the censors were religious. For example, the Catholic Church sanctioned Diderot's encyclopedia for its brazen questioning of religious authority. But even with the attempts at censorship, the reading revolution took hold and people were reading more than ever. And it wasn't only books that people were reading. There was an explosion of newspapers and periodicals and pamphlets as well. Enlightenment thinkers, natural scientists, and explorers traveled the globe during this period, and as they returned, they wrote down their observations, and that had two effects. First, it exposed the literate European population to cultures outside their own. Second, some of these depictions challenged Europeans' accepted social norms. For example, explorers who wrote about the indigenous societies in the Americas showed that they were not as rigidly hierarchical as European societies. In terms of art, the emphasis shifted on the celebration of religious themes and royal power of kings to the private life and the public good. Until about 1750, art in the Baroque style promoted religious feeling and was employed by monarchs to illustrate state power. It was a style that sought to awe people with its opulence and detail and ostentatious features. For example, Gian Lorenzo Bernini sculpted magnificent piazzas and designed ornate chapels for the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote many of his compositions to be performed in a royal court or high church services. But in the 18th century, the nature and subject matter of art shifted from the state and religious themes to themes that appealed to the bourgeois society, which is to say the middle class. This new style of art was called neoclassicism. In contrast to the opulence and the grandeur of Baroque, neoclassical artists prized simplicity and symmetry. And this was especially emphasized in literature. You had Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe. It's the story of a man shipwrecked on an island who learns to survive and thrive, and does all of this without any guidance from religious authority or Christian doctrine. You also had Jane Austen, who wrote Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. Her stories were concerned with the middle and upper classes of England and what their morals were, how they upheld them, and then sometimes violated them. But not only was art undergoing change, so was the manner in which Europeans bought stuff, and for this I need to tell you about the consumer revolution. As industrialization took root during this period, the middle and upper classes had much more disposable income than ever before. And the result was increased demand for consumer goods that were being manufactured all over Europe. People now began buying goods not necessarily because they needed them, but because they wanted them. And these goods included porcelain dishes, mirrors, cotton and linens for home decor, and all kinds of things. Now you're going to need to know the consequences of the consumer revolution as well. First was a new concern for privacy. Prior to the consumer revolution, homes were smaller and simpler, like with only a few rooms in the house, each room had multiple purposes. But now people began to design homes with more rooms, each of which had its own specific purpose. And the increasing concern for privacy meant that people were building new kinds of rooms in their houses, such as the boudoir. This was a room specifically designed for the wife of the house to be apart from her husband, either alone or entertaining other women. Another consequence of the consumer revolution was the increasing demand for new venues for leisure, perhaps chief among them coffee houses. Thanks to the Columbian Exchange, coffee was growing in popularity among Europeans, and they built coffee houses in order to drink that magnificent beverage. In contrast to taverns, where you got drunk and sang loud songs, coffee houses were open to men of all classes, and the emphasis was on discussing the revolutionary ideas of the day. Okay, click right here to grab my ultimate review packet if you want help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And these videos right over here go into way more depth on Unit 4 topics, so click away. Heimler out.